Ethan Carter never thought he'd find himself in a courtroom, facing the woman who had controlled his life for years. Diana Carter, the stepmother who the world saw as a wealthy, caring figure, was anything but. Behind closed doors, she was manipulative, cruel, and hiding secrets darker than anyone could imagine. But today, the truth is finally coming to light. Armed with evidence, a determined attorney, and unexpected allies, Ethan is ready to expose everything. Yet Diana is not the type to go down without a fight. Lies will be told, alliances will shatter, and shocking revelations will turn the trial into a battle no one saw coming. Will justice be served? Or will Diana manipulate her way out once again? Stay until the end to witness a verdict that will leave everyone speechless. And before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Ethan Carter adjusted the oversized suit jacket his cousin had lent him. The sleeves were too long and the shoulders sagged, but he didn't care. Today wasn't about appearances. Today was about justice. As he stepped into the courtroom, a heavy silence fell over the spectators. Journalists sat in the back, ready to turn this high-profile court case into the latest headline. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes, watched Ethan with curiosity. And across the courtroom, sitting confidently at the defendant's table, was Diana Carter, his stepmother. She didn't look nervous, not even a little. Instead, she offered him a small, rehearsed smile, the same kind she used in public to make everyone believe she was a caring mother. Ethan clenched his fists. He had waited for this moment for years. His father, Daniel Carter, sat beside Diana, not on Ethan's side, but next to the woman who had made his life a nightmare. Ethan's heart pounded, but he didn't let the betrayal distract him. His father had chosen a side, and it wasn't his. "Mr. Carter," the judge's voice echoed across the courtroom. "Are you ready to begin?" Ethan took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Yes, Your Honor." The prosecutor, a tall woman named Olivia Moore, approached the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, today you will hear the story of a boy who has endured years of abuse behind closed doors. You will see evidence that proves Diana Carter is not the loving stepmother she claims to be. And you will learn the truth that has been hidden for far too long." Diana remained still, her lawyer, one of the best defense attorneys in the city, smirking beside her. "This is just a child's imagination," he said smoothly. A desperate attempt to seek attention. Ethan didn't react. He had prepared for this. He knew they would call him a liar, but what they didn't know was that he had proof. "I would like to present Exhibit A," Olivia announced. A large screen in the courtroom lit up, showing a video. The audio played first. Diana's voice, sharp and filled with anger, rang through the speakers. "You are nothing, Ethan. Nothing. You don't deserve this family's money." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Ethan watched as the jurors exchanged glances. Even the judge shifted in his seat. Diana, however, simply laughed. "Audio can be manipulated," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "Technology today can make anyone sound guilty." Her lawyer nodded. "That recording proves nothing." Ethan glanced at Olivia. This was expected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Then maybe this will." He handed the phone to the bailiff, who connected it to the court system. The screen changed. A bank statement appeared, showing a recent transfer of $100,000 from Daniel Carter's account to Diana's. Ethan turned to his father. "Dad, do you still want to say you had nothing to do with this?" Daniel's face turned pale. His mouth opened, then closed. The courtroom erupted into whispers. The judge banged his gavel. "Order in the court." Diana leaned closer to Daniel, her expression no longer calm. Ethan could see the first crack in her mask. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't dared to before: hope. But he knew this was just the beginning. Outside the courtroom, the world watched. The cameras rolled. The truth was starting to come out. and Ethan Carter was ready to expose it all. A tense silence filled the courtroom. The judge's gavel still echoed as murmurs rippled through the audience. Ethan remained standing, his heart pounding, but he refused to show fear. He had just exposed his father's secret financial transaction to Diana Carter, and now, for the first time, cracks were forming in their perfect defense. Across the courtroom, Diana's composed expression didn't falter, but Ethan noticed how her fingers clenched tightly around the armrest of her chair. She leaned toward Daniel, whispering something urgent. His father, still pale, barely reacted. "Mr. Carter," the judge addressed Daniel, his voice sharp. "Do you wish to respond to your son's statement?" Daniel hesitated. Ethan could see the conflict in his eyes. His father was a man who thrived on control, yet right now he was trapped, cornered in a courtroom filled with people waiting for his answer. I only transferred that money to support my wife," Daniel finally said, his voice uncertain. Ethan is twisting things. Olivia Moore, the prosecutor, immediately stepped forward. "So you admit to transferring a large sum of money to Mrs. Carter just days before this trial?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "It was for legal fees." "Legal fees?" Olivia raised an eyebrow. "Then why was the transaction marked under a private offshore account?" A murmur spread through the jury box. Diana's mask of indifference was starting to slip. Ethan didn't miss the way her jaw tightened. She had always been good at deception, but he knew the truth she was unraveling. "Mrs. Carter," Olivia continued, turning her attention to Diana, "would you like to explain why your husband sent you this money right before you were accused of child abuse and fraud?" Diana finally spoke, her voice smooth as ever. "Of course. My husband has always supported me. This money was to ensure I had the best legal defense possible." "And yet," Olivia countered, "your attorney was already paid in full before this transfer was made. So why did you need more money?" Diana tilted her head, her eyes cold and calculating. "I don't have to explain how my husband and I manage our finances. That's not relevant to this case." "The jury will decide that," Olivia shot back. Ethan studied Diana carefully. He had spent years watching her manipulate people, twisting words, making herself appear innocent. But this time, she wasn't in control. This time she was on the defensive. And then it happened. Diana made her first mistake. "I would never harm Ethan," she said, her voice louder now. "He's just a troubled child with a wild imagination. He makes things up for attention." Ethan knew that line well. She had used it for years whenever teachers, neighbors, or concerned adults questioned the bruises on his arms, or why he always seemed afraid to go home. But this time, she said it in court, where every word was being recorded, analyzed, and scrutinized. Before Olivia could respond, Ethan took a step forward. "You say I make things up," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Then why did Mrs. Henderson, our housekeeper, quit after working for our family for 5 years? Why did she tell the police that she witnessed you hit me?" Diana's fingers twitched. She opened her mouth, but Ethan continued. "Why did I write about the abuse in my journal every single day? Why do I have scars that match the exact places where you used to grab me when you got angry?" The jury watched him intently. Ethan could feel their attention shifting. They weren't looking at Diana the way they had before. The doubt in their eyes was growing. Diana scoffed, shaking her head. "That's nonsense. If I were such a horrible person, why didn't anyone say anything sooner?" "It was the wrong thing to say," a voice from the back of the courtroom answered. "I wanted to, but I was afraid." The entire room turned as an older woman stood up. It was Eleanor Carter, Ethan's grandmother. For years, she had been silent. For years, Diana had convinced everyone that she was too old, too forgetful to be taken seriously. But now here she was, standing tall in a courtroom filled with cameras and witnesses. "I remember everything," Eleanor said, her voice strong despite her age. "And I will not stay silent any longer." Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat. For the first time in years, He wasn't fighting alone, and Diana Carter knew it. A stunned silence filled the courtroom as Eleanor Carter slowly stepped forward. Ethan's grandmother had always been dismissed as fragile, forgetful, and too old to notice what had been happening in the house. But now, in front of the jury, the judge, and the entire courtroom, she stood with a quiet strength Ethan had never seen before. Diana's confidence wavered for the first time. Her perfectly constructed facade was beginning to crack. She quickly glanced at Daniel, but Ethan's father remained frozen, his face unreadable. Mrs. Carter, Olivia Moore, the prosecutor, addressed Eleanor. Are you saying you have first-hand knowledge of the abuse Ethan suffered? Eleanor lifted her chin. Yes. I saw things. I heard things. But every time I tried to speak up, I was told I was confused, that I was too old to understand what was really happening. She turned to Diana, her sharp gaze locking onto the woman who had tormented her grandson. But I know exactly what you did. Diana forced a laugh. With all due respect, Eleanor, you barely remember what day it is. You expect the court to believe I remember the night Ethan came running to my room with bruises on his arms. Eleanor cut her off. I remember the fear in his eyes when you dragged him away, telling him to stop making up stories. A murmur spread through the jury. Ethan swallowed hard, emotions building inside him. He had spent years feeling alone, convinced that no one had truly seen what he endured. But his grandmother had seen. She had always known. Diana's lawyer quickly stood. Objection. This is hearsay. There is no physical evidence to support. There is. Eleanor interrupted, pulling something from her purse. A small, tattered notebook. Ethan isn't the only one who kept records. Ethan's eyes widened. His grandmother had kept her own journal? The judge leaned forward. Proceed carefully, Mrs. Carter. Eleanor handed the notebook to Olivia, who opened it and read aloud. July 14th, 2024. I heard Ethan crying again. I knocked on his door, but Diana answered instead. She told me he was being punished. When I tried to push past her, she slammed the door in my face. August 3rd, 2024. Ethan's wrist was bruised today. He said he fell. I don't believe him. I wanted to tell Daniel, but he wouldn't listen. October 10th, 2024. Ethan begged me to help him. He said he couldn't take it anymore. I told him to be strong, that one day the truth would come out. I only hope I haven't waited too long. The courtroom was completely silent. Even Diana had nothing to say. Ethan's throat tightened. His grandmother had been watching, waiting for a chance to help him. And now here she was. The judge cleared his throat. This evidence will be reviewed. Ethan met Diana's eyes. For the first time, she looked afraid, and he knew this was far from over. The courtroom remained in heavy silence as the prosecutor, Olivia Moore, carefully flipped through Eleanor Carter's notebook. The words written inside were damning detailed accounts of abuse, neglect, and the manipulation Diana Carter had used to keep the truth hidden for years. Diana sat stiffly at the defense table, her hands clenched into fists. For the first time, she didn't have a quick response. Her carefully curated image as a loving stepmother was beginning to collapse under the weight of real evidence. Ethan watched as the judge adjusted his glasses and glanced toward Olivia. Ms. Moore, do you intend to enter this notebook into evidence? Yes, Your Honor. Olivia stepped forward, handing it to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge's bench. This journal was kept by Mrs. Eleanor Carter, who personally witnessed multiple instances of abusive behavior toward the plaintiff, Ethan Carter. It documents key events and corroborates Ethan's own accounts. Diana's lawyer, Mr. Calloway, quickly rose to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. There is no proof that this notebook was written at the time of these alleged events. For all we know, Mrs. Carter could have fabricated this after the accusations against my client surfaced. Eleanor let out a small scoff. Are you suggesting I sat down and wrote an entire year's worth of journal entries just for fun? Her voice was sharp, her age suddenly irrelevant in the strength of her conviction. A small chuckle rippled through the courtroom, but the judge silenced it with a single look. He turned back to Calloway. "Your objection is noted. However, the court will review the authenticity of the journal. If the timestamps and handwriting analysis confirm its legitimacy, it will be accepted as evidence." Diana shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Ethan kept his eyes on her, studying the small changes in her demeanor. She was losing control and she knew it. But he also knew she wouldn't go down without a fight. "Let's talk about what's not in that journal," Calloway said smoothly, turning the focus away from the damaging evidence. "There are no photographs, no medical records of injuries, no police reports. If Ethan truly suffered the way he claims, why didn't he tell a teacher? A friend? Anyone?" Ethan clenched his jaw. He knew this question was coming. He had thought about it every single day. Why hadn't he spoken up sooner? Why hadn't he screamed for help when he had the chance? He took a deep breath, then stepped forward. "I was afraid." His voice was steady, even as the memories swirled in his mind. "Diana always knew how to cover her tracks. When I got hurt, she made sure I stayed home until the bruises faded. When I cried, she told me no one would believe me. When I tried to stand up for myself, Ethan swallowed hard. She reminded me that my own father would take her side." A flicker of something crossed Daniel Carter's face. Guilt. Shame. Maybe both. "She convinced me that if I spoke up, I'd end up in foster care," Ethan continued. "That no one would want me, that I was better off staying quiet." He turned his gaze to the jury. "And for a long time, I believed her." A heavy silence filled the room. The jury members looked at each other, their expressions shifting. Even those who had seemed skeptical now appeared uncertain. Diana let out a sharp laugh, trying to regain control. "This is absurd. He's an emotionally unstable child making up stories. I was only ever strict with him because he needed discipline. That's what good parents do." "Discipline?" Eleanor repeated, her voice shaking with anger. "Locking a child in a dark room for hours is discipline? Grabbing him hard enough to leave bruises is discipline?" Diana's lawyer placed a hand on her arm, silently urging her to stay quiet. She jerked her arm away, glaring at Ethan. "You think you're winning, don't you?" she hissed. "You think all of this means anything?" Ethan didn't flinch. He met her gaze head-on. "I don't think I'm winning," he said calmly. "I know the truth is finally coming out." Diana scoffed, crossing her arms. But there was something different in her eyes now, an edge of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. The judge cleared his throat, bringing attention back to the bench. "We will take a brief recess while the court reviews the journal and considers the validity of this testimony. We will resume shortly." The gavel struck, signaling a pause in the proceedings. As the jury members stood and began filing out, Ethan finally let out the breath he had been holding. He turned to his grandmother, who placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You were incredible," she whispered. He wanted to believe her, but he knew this wasn't over yet. Diana Carter had spent years manipulating people. She wouldn't just sit back and let the truth destroy her. And Ethan had the sinking feeling that she still had a few tricks left to play. The courtroom emptied for recess, but Ethan Carter didn't move from his seat. His heart was still pounding from his last exchange with Diana. The way she had looked at him sharp, calculating told him that she wasn't finished yet. She was losing control, and when Diana Carter felt trapped, she became dangerous. His grandmother, Eleanor, sat beside him, her wrinkled hand resting gently over his. "She's scared," she whispered. "She knows she's running out of options." Ethan nodded, but he wasn't ready to celebrate. Not yet. Across the room, Diana sat with her lawyer, speaking in hushed tones. Her husband, his father, stood slightly apart, rubbing his temples, as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. He hadn't defended Ethan. He hadn't even looked at him. That hurt more than Ethan wanted to admit. Ethan, Olivia Moore, his attorney, knelt beside him. I need you to be ready when we go back in. We have momentum, but I don't trust Diana to go down without a fight." Ethan swallowed and straightened his back. "I'm ready." A court clerk approached the bench, signaling the end of recess. Within minutes, the courtroom filled again. The jury returned to their seats, and the judge took his place. The air felt heavier now, as if everyone sensed that something big was about to happen. "All rise," the bailiff announced as the judge banged his gavel. "Court is now in session." Judge Whitaker adjusted his glasses. "Before we proceed, I have reviewed the journal submitted into evidence. The timestamps are verified, and the handwriting matches Mrs. Carter's prior legal documents. This court will accept the journal as legitimate evidence." A small sigh of relief escaped Ethan's lips. But across the courtroom, Diana's expression darkened. "I'd like to recall Ethan Carter to the stand," Olivia announced. Ethan felt his pulse quicken, but he stood and walked to the witness stand. As he sat, he could feel Diana's eyes drilling into him. Olivia approached, her voice calm but firm. "Ethan, can you tell the court about the night you decided to come forward?" Ethan took a breath. "It was the night I found out she was trying to sell my mom's house, the house she left for me." The jury shifted in their seats. This was new information. Even Diana's lawyer looked momentarily caught off guard. "Explain what happened," Olivia encouraged. Ethan nodded. "I overheard a phone call. Diana was talking to a real estate agent, asking how soon she could finalize the sale. My name was on the deed, but I had never signed anything." Olivia turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to introduce Exhibit B, a copy of the fraudulent sales contract." A screen in the courtroom lit up, displaying the document. "Notice the signature," Olivia continued. "It's a forged version of Ethan's name. An analysis confirms it does not match his legal signature." Diana's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection. This is speculation. There is no proof my client was responsible for this." Olivia turned to Diana. "Mrs. Carter, are you denying that you attempted to sell the house?" Diana hesitated. Because if you are," Olivia continued, "I have another piece of evidence." A new image appeared on the courtroom screen, a series of text messages between Diana and the real estate agent. "How soon can we sell?" "The boy doesn't need to know. Just get it done before the trial starts." The jury gasped. Ethan clenched his fists. He had known she was capable of cruelty, but this was a whole new level of betrayal. Diana's face went pale. That could be anyone. The number is registered to your name," Olivia countered. "Would you like to claim someone else used your phone?" Diana's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in the entire trial, she looked truly trapped. Ethan's father finally spoke up. "Diana," he said quietly, "is it true?" She turned to him, her eyes flashing with something unreadable. "Daniel, don't," but he stepped back, his face twisted in horror. "You told me this was all a misunderstanding, that Ethan was lying. But he ran a hand through his hair. You forged his signature? You tried to steal from my son." Ethan's breath caught. His father, who had been silent for so long, was finally seeing the truth. Diana snapped. "You are just as guilty as I am," she spat. "You gave me the account access. You let me control everything." Gasps filled the courtroom. Judge Whitaker banged his gavel. "Order in the court." Diana realized what she had done. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to take the words back, but it was too late. For the first time, Daniel Carter looked at his wife as if he were seeing her for the monster she really was. And for the first time, Ethan felt something toward his father that he hadn't in a long time. Hope. The courtroom was thick with tension, the air heavy with the weight of Diana Carter's outburst. Her own words had become a weapon against her, and the jury knew it. Ethan sat in the witness stand, his heart pounding. For the first time, his father, Daniel Carter, was no longer looking at him with indifference. He was staring at Diana as if she were a stranger. Judge Whitaker leaned forward. "Mrs. Carter, Are you admitting that you knowingly forged Ethan Carter's signature to sell the property? Diana's face turned pale, but she recovered quickly. Of course not, she snapped. I was emotional. I misspoke. Olivia Moore, the prosecutor, stepped forward, her voice steady. Misspoke? You just admitted, in front of this entire court, that Mr. Carter assisted you in managing financial matters, including those that involved his son's inheritance. Diana clenched her jaw, but before she could respond, Daniel stood up. His face was tight with anger, his hands shaking. Your Honor, he paused, glancing at Ethan before exhaling sharply. I had no idea she forged Ethan's signature. I knew about the money transfers, but she told me it was for legal expenses. She never told me about selling the house. Diana turned on him instantly. You're lying, she hissed. Daniel ignored her, focusing on the judge. I was blind. I let her manipulate me, but I never wanted to hurt my son. His voice faltered, and for the first time, genuine regret flickered across his face. I didn't protect him. I should have. Ethan felt something inside him shift. For years, he had told himself that his father was just as bad as Diana. But now, for the first time, he saw a man who had been played just as much as he had. Olivia seized the moment. Mr. Carter, are you willing to testify against your wife? Diana's eyes widened in horror. Daniel, don't you dare. But Daniel hesitated only for a moment before nodding. Yes. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Diana slammed her hands on the table. You spineless coward. Judge Whitaker banged his gavel. Mrs. Carter, I will not tolerate outbursts in my court. Consider this your final warning. Diana sat back, her entire body trembling with rage. Olivia turned back to Ethan. One last question, Ethan. If Diana is convicted today, what do you hope will happen next? Ethan's gaze flickered toward his father before settling on Diana. I want justice, he said simply. I want to stop being afraid, and I want to live in a home where I don't have to wonder if I'll be hurt again. The jury listened intently, their faces unreadable, but Ethan could feel that the tide was turning. Judge Whitaker cleared his throat. We will now hear from the defense. Diana's lawyer, Mr. Calloway, stood, smoothing his suit. Your Honor, my client has been unfairly portrayed as a villain. There is no medical proof of injury, no police report before this case, and much of this so-called evidence is based on subjective testimony. Olivia interjected. With all due respect, we have recordings, financial records, and a forged document. That's more than enough proof. Calloway waved her off. Ethan Carter has been coached. He's a child who is angry, and anger distorts the truth. I intend to prove that my client was strict, but never abusive. Diana lifted her chin, regaining some of her composure. She turned to the jury, her expression softening. I loved Ethan like he was my own. I made sacrifices for him, and this is how he repays me. Ethan clenched his fists. How could she still act like she was the victim? Calloway continued. I would like to call a witness, a former teacher of Ethan Carter's. Ethan's stomach twisted. He hadn't expected this. A woman in her 40s walked into the courtroom and took the stand. She had sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Please state your name, Calloway instructed. Ms. Linda Holloway, she answered. Calloway paced in front of her. Ms. Holloway, you taught Ethan in middle school. Can you describe his behavior in class? She nodded. Ethan was quiet, withdrawn. He never caused trouble, but he seemed scared sometimes. Calloway frowned. Scared of what? Ms. Holloway hesitated. I wasn't sure. I asked if everything was okay at home, but he always said he was fine. Diana's lawyer smiled. So, in other words, he never actually told you he was being abused? Ms. Holloway nodded. That's correct. Calloway turned triumphantly to the jury. There you have it. Even his own teacher never heard any complaints. This is all a well-crafted story by a boy with a grudge. Ethan's pulse raced. This was exactly the kind of argument he had feared. Then Ms. Holloway spoke again. "But," she added, "that doesn't mean I didn't see the signs. Ethan wasn't acting like a normal child, and I regret not pushing harder to find out the truth." The jury stirred. Olivia seized the opportunity. "Ms. Holloway, in your professional opinion, do children in abusive homes always admit what's happening?" "No," she said firmly. "In fact, most don't." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. She believed him. Diana's confidence wavered again. The judge sighed. "We will reconvene tomorrow. Court is adjourned for the day." The gavel struck, and the courtroom emptied once again. Ethan turned to Olivia. "Did we win today?" She gave him a small smile. "We made a dent, but we still have work to do." As Ethan walked toward the exit, he glanced back at Diana. She sat alone, her hands gripping the table, her eyes dark with fury. She wasn't done fighting, and neither was he. The sun had barely risen when Ethan arrived at the courthouse the next morning. His body felt heavy with exhaustion, but his mind was racing. Yesterday had been a small victory. His father had turned against Diana, and even his former teacher had admitted to seeing signs of abuse. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. As he walked through the marble halls, his attorney, Olivia Moore, approached him. She held a file in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. "You doing okay?" she asked, handing him a bottle of water instead. Ethan took it with a nod. "I guess, but Diana's lawyer made me look like a liar yesterday." Olivia sighed. "That was expected. The defense's entire strategy is to create doubt. They don't need to prove Diana is innocent, they just need to make the jury question your story." Ethan tightened his grip around the bottle. "What if they believe her?" "They won't," Olivia said firmly. "Not after today." Ethan looked up. "What's happening today?" Olivia smiled. "You'll see." The tension was thicker than the day before. The jury members were more alert now, as if they knew the trial was reaching a critical point. Diana sat at the defense table, her hands folded neatly. But Ethan noticed how she kept tapping her foot. She was nervous. Judge Whitaker entered, and the bailiff called for order. "Court is now in session." Olivia stood first. "Your Honor, I would like to call a new witness to the stand." She turned toward the back of the courtroom. "Mrs. Henderson, please step forward." Ethan's breath caught. Mrs. Henderson, their former housekeeper, an older woman with silver hair and a kind but serious face, walked toward the witness stand. She had worked for the Carter family for 5 years before abruptly quitting. At the time, Diana had told everyone she left for personal reasons, but Ethan had always suspected the truth was more complicated. "Mrs. Henderson," Olivia began, "can you explain why you resigned from the Carter household?" Mrs. Henderson glanced toward Diana before taking a deep breath. "I left because I couldn't watch what was happening anymore." A ripple of whispers spread across the courtroom. Diana's lawyer, Mr. Calloway, stood. "Objection. Speculation." Olivia shook her head. "I think the witness is about to clarify." Judge Whitaker nodded. "Proceed, but be precise, Mrs. Henderson." Mrs. Henderson turned back to the jury. "I saw things. I heard things. I saw bruises on Ethan's arms, but every time I asked, he told me he had fallen. I saw how he flinched when Diana raised her voice. I heard her screaming at him behind closed doors. Diana's face twisted in anger, but she remained silent." Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice growing stronger. "One night, I saw her grab Ethan by the wrist, so hard he cried out. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. But when I tried to report it to Mr. Carter, he told me to stay out of it." Daniel Carter, who had been sitting quietly, lowered his head in shame. "I quit because I couldn't bear to watch anymore," Mrs. Henderson finished, her voice thick with emotion. "And I regret not speaking up sooner." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. Olivia let the words settle before asking, "Mrs. Henderson, do you believe Ethan was telling the truth about the abuse?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. Calloway quickly stood. Cross-examination, Your Honor. Judge Whitaker gestured for him to proceed. Calloway approached the witness stand, adjusting his suit. Mrs. Henderson, you claim to have witnessed these things, yet you never reported them to the police. Mrs. Henderson met his gaze. I should have, and I will regret that for the rest of my life. Calloway paced. But you didn't, which means legally there is no record of these incidents, correct? She hesitated. Correct. Calloway turned to the jury, his voice smooth. This is a classic case of hindsight guilt. The witness may believe she saw something, but belief is not proof. She has no medical records, no photos, and no reports to back her claims. Ethan's stomach twisted. But then Mrs. Henderson pulled something from her bag, a small USB drive. I was afraid to go to the police, she said, her voice firm, but I wasn't stupid. I recorded one of their fights. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Judge Whitaker immediately ordered order. Ms. Moore, do you wish to submit this into evidence? Yes, Your Honor. Olivia took the USB and handed it to the bailiff, who connected it to the court system. A moment later, the speakers came to life. Diana's voice filled the room. You think you're special, Ethan? You're nothing without this family's money. You have no one but me, and you better learn to be grateful. A loud slap echoed through the recording. Then a choke sob. Ethan squeezed his hands into fists. He remembered that night. The jury looked horrified. Even the judge seemed affected. Calloway paled. Your Honor, we were not informed of this. Judge Whitaker raised a hand. The recording will be reviewed for authenticity. If verified, it will be considered as evidence. Diana shot to her feet. That's private. He was being a brat. I was just Judge Whitaker's gavel slammed down. Sit down. Now. Diana's face turned red with rage, but she obeyed. Ethan let out a shaky breath. This was it. This was what they needed. The truth was no longer just words. It was undeniable. And for the first time, Diana Carter had nothing left to hide behind. The courtroom was deathly silent, but the tension was suffocating. The echoes of Diana Carter's recorded voice still seemed to linger in the air. No one spoke. No one moved. The jury sat frozen, their expressions ranging from horror to disbelief. Ethan felt his pulse in his throat. He had lived through that moment, endured the pain of it. But hearing it out loud, watching the entire courtroom react to it, made it real in a way he had never experienced before. Diana, however, looked ready to explode. That recording is illegal, she hissed, turning to her lawyer. I never consented to being recorded in my own home. That's a violation of my privacy. Judge Whitaker's gavel slammed down. Mrs. Carter, I will not warn you again. Another outburst, and I will hold you in contempt of court. Diana clenched her jaw and dropped back into her seat, but Ethan saw it, the flicker of panic in her eyes. Olivia Moore, the prosecutor, stepped forward, her tone firm. Your Honor, the state of New York allows audio recordings to be submitted as evidence if at least one party involved consents to the recording. Since Ethan Carter was present during the incident, the recording is admissible. Calloway, Diana's lawyer, looked rattled. Your Honor, I'd like to request a recess to review this evidence. Request denied, Judge Whitaker said immediately. The jury has already heard the recording. We will proceed. Ethan swallowed hard. This was it. Diana was cornered. But he knew her too. Well, she wouldn't go down without a fight. Olivia turned to Mrs. Henderson. Mrs. Henderson, did you alter this recording in any way? No, the housekeeper replied. I copied it from my personal phone directly onto the USB. Thank you. Olivia turned to the jury. This is not a misunderstanding. This is not a disciplinary parent setting boundaries. This is the voice of a woman who emotionally and physically abused a child for years, convinced that no one would ever catch her. She let the words sink in before adding, and now that she has been caught, she's still trying to manipulate her way out. Diana shook her head in disbelief, her hands gripping the edge of the defense table. Calloway, who had been carefully composed throughout the trial, now looked visibly stressed. Then Diana did something Ethan hadn't expected. She laughed. It was quiet at first, but soon a cold, humorless chuckle escaped her lips. She leaned back in her chair, shaking her head. "You people are ridiculous," she muttered. "All of this over some brat who wanted attention." A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Even Calloway looked horrified. Diana turned her glare toward Ethan. "You think this makes you powerful? That these people actually care about you? You're just a pathetic little boy playing the victim." Ethan clenched his fists under the witness stand. But before he could say anything, a new voice spoke. "That's enough." His father, Daniel Carter, slowly stood from his seat, his face pale but resolute. "Diana," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "stop. Just stop." Diana scoffed. "Oh, now, you want to be a father?" Daniel ignored her and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to change my statement." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Calloway immediately turned. "Mr. Carter, I advise you to—" "No," Daniel cut him off. "I've been silent for too long." He exhaled sharply before looking at Ethan, truly looking at him for the first time. "Ethan, I failed you." Ethan felt his breath hitch. Daniel turned back to the judge. "I allowed Diana to control everything. I let her handle the finances, the household, even my own son. And deep down I knew something was wrong. I saw the bruises. I heard the way she spoke to him. And I did nothing." He swallowed hard. "I was a coward." Diana shot to her feet. "Daniel, you're idiot. Do you realize what you're saying?" Judge Whitaker slammed his gavel. "Mrs. Carter, sit down immediately." But Daniel wasn't finished. "I can't undo what I let happen, but I can tell the truth now." He looked at Ethan again. "I'm sorry." Ethan's hands trembled. For so long, he had given up on his father, convinced the man would never stand up for him. And now, here he was, finally breaking free from Diana's grip. Olivia turned to the judge. "Your Honor, in light of Mr. Carter's statement, we request a plea deal be offered to him in exchange for full cooperation." Calloway was already shaking his head. "Absolutely not, I accept," Daniel said quickly. The courtroom erupted into shocked whispers. Judge Whitaker nodded. "Very well. We will discuss terms after the verdict." He turned to the jury. "You have now heard overwhelming testimony and physical evidence against Mrs. Carter. You will retire to deliberate." The jury stood and filed out of the courtroom. Ethan sat frozen in place, his emotions tangled. This was it, the moment he had waited for. He looked at Diana, who was breathing heavily, her eyes darting around the room. She looked smaller now, weaker. The woman who had tormented him for years was no longer in control. The jury would decide her fate. And Ethan could finally see the end. The jury had been deliberating for nearly 3 hours. Each ticking second felt like an eternity to Ethan Carter. He sat in the courtroom, his hands gripping the edge of his seat, waiting, hoping. Across the room, Diana Carter sat motionless, her once perfectly composed demeanor reduced to nothing more than raw tension. Her lawyer, Mr. Calloway, whispered to her occasionally, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't talking. She had no more control over the narrative. Ethan glanced at his father. Daniel Carter sat with his head bowed, his hands clasped together. He had admitted his failures, had finally stood up for Ethan, but that didn't erase the years of silence. Still, something had shifted. The bailiff stepped forward. "All rise." Ethan's breath caught as the judge entered the courtroom. Then, the jury returned, filing into their seats one by one. Some avoided looking at Diana. Others had tight expressions, their faces unreadable. Judge Whitaker turned to the foreperson. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" A woman in her 50s stood, holding a folded slip of paper. "Yes, Your Honor." Ethan's heart pounded so loudly he barely heard the paper rustling as the foreperson unfolded it. In the case of the state of New York versus Diana Carter, on the charge of child endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. A murmur spread through the courtroom, but the foreperson wasn't done. On the charge of fraudulent activity, we find the defendant guilty. Diana flinched, her fingers gripping the table. And on the charge of domestic abuse, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Ethan barely processed the sound of the gavel slamming as Judge Whitaker called for order. His mind was spinning, his chest tightening. Guilty. Every single charge. He had won. Diana, however, didn't take it well. She shot up from her seat, her eyes wild with fury. "You people are fools," she spat, her voice shaking. "This is a setup. He's lying. That boy, he's been manipulating all of you." Ethan stared at her, the woman who had tormented him for years, now unraveling in front of everyone. But he felt nothing. No fear. No hatred. Just relief. The bailiffs moved in, grabbing her by the arms. "Get your hands off me," she shrieked, thrashing wildly. "Daniel, do something. You spineless coward." Daniel didn't move. He didn't even look at her. Diana let out a bitter laugh. "Fine. You think you've won, Ethan? You think this means anything? You'll always be that weak, pathetic little boy, Mrs. Carter." Judge Whitaker cut in, his voice sharp. "That's enough. You have been convicted on all counts. Sentencing will be determined at a later hearing. Until then, you will be held in state custody without bail." Diana went completely still. Ethan could see it in her eyes. She had never imagined this outcome. She had spent years manipulating everyone around her, always staying one step ahead. But not anymore. The bailiffs led her toward the exit, her heels scraping against the polished floor. Just before she was taken through the doors, she turned her head. Ethan braced himself for more venom, more empty threats. Instead, all he saw was fear. Then she was gone. The courtroom remained tense, the weight of the verdict still settling. Ethan let out a shaky breath, barely able to believe it was over. Beside him, his grandmother, Eleanor Carter, squeezed his hand. "You did it," she whispered. His father turned toward him, his expression unreadable. Ethan stood. His body felt light, unsteady. "I need some air." Without waiting for a response, he walked out of the courtroom. The moment Ethan stepped outside, the crisp autumn air filled his lungs. The sky was a soft blue, the city moving around him as if nothing had happened. But for him, everything had changed. He had won. Diana Carter was going to prison. He was free. Yet, as he stood on the courthouse steps, a strange emptiness settled in his chest. For years, his life had been about surviving her. Now, for the first time, he had to figure out what came next. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Ethan." He turned. His father stood a few feet away, his hands shoved into his pockets, looking unsure for the first time in his life. "I know an apology isn't enough," Daniel said quietly. "But I want to try, if you'll let me." Ethan studied him, searching for the usual coldness, the distant man he had always known. But his father looked different now, worn, maybe even ashamed. Ethan wasn't sure if he could forgive him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But for the first time, Daniel Carter wasn't making excuses. He was just trying. And maybe that was enough for now. Ethan Carter stood on the courthouse steps, the cool autumn breeze brushing against his face. The city around him moved as if today was just another day. But for him, everything had changed. The courtroom, which had once felt like a battlefield, was now behind him. Diana Carter was gone, convicted, guilty, no longer in control of his life. Yet, as he stood there, he didn't feel the overwhelming joy he had expected. The weight pressing on his chest for years had lifted, but something else settled in its place: uncertainty. What now? His father, Daniel Carter, remained a few feet away, watching him carefully. "Ethan," he said again, his voice quieter this time. I know I don't deserve to ask for anything from you, but can we talk? Ethan turned to look at him fully. Talk about what? Daniel exhaled sharply. About what comes next. Ethan crossed his arms. You think one apology is going to fix everything? No, Daniel admitted. I don't. I know I failed you. I let her, he hesitated, his voice thick with guilt. I let Diana do terrible things to you. And I didn't stop it. I should have. Ethan studied him carefully. His father had always been a man who spoke in half-truths, someone who avoided responsibility. But today, there was no defensiveness, no excuses. Just regret. Where were you? Ethan finally asked. His voice wasn't angry, just tired. All those times I needed you? Why didn't you see what was happening? Daniel ran a hand through his graying hair. I think, deep down, I did see it. But I convinced myself it wasn't that bad. That she was strict, not abusive. That you were just acting out. And when I did start to see the truth, he let out a shaky breath. I was a coward. I took the easy way out. And I will regret that for the rest of my life. Silence stretched between them. Ethan wasn't sure what he had expected. Maybe another excuse, maybe an attempt to shift blame. But this was different. You can't erase what happened, Ethan said. I know. And I don't know if I can forgive you. Daniel nodded. I understand. He hesitated, then added, but if you ever decide that you want to, I'll be here. No expectations. Just here. Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out at the city, watching the world move forward. Maybe that was what he needed to do, too. He took a deep breath. I don't know what comes next. Daniel gave him a small, sad smile. Then maybe we figure it out together. 6 months later, the courtroom was behind him, now both literally and figuratively. Life had changed in ways Ethan never imagined. Diana Carter had been sentenced to 15 years in prison with no chance of early release. The verdict had made headlines, but after a few weeks, the world moved on. Ethan, however, was still learning how to move forward. He now lived with his grandmother, Eleanor Carter, in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city. It was a small house, nothing like the mansion Diana once ruled over, but it was warm, safe. His father had kept his word. He didn't force his way back into Ethan's life, but he showed up small things at first. A call every week, an offer to grab coffee. It wasn't perfect, but for the first time, Ethan felt like his father was trying. One afternoon, as Ethan sat on the porch flipping through his old notebook, a familiar voice called out. Still writing. Everything down? Ethan looked up and smiled slightly. Lucas, his best friend, the hacker genius, who had helped expose Diana's real estate fraud, walked up the steps and flopped down beside him. Old habits, Ethan admitted. Lucas smirked. I still think you should write a book about all of this. Ethan chuckled. And call it what? How to Survive an Evil Stepmother. Lucas grinned. Hey, I'd read it. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Lucas added, So are you happy? Ethan thought about it. For years, happiness had felt like something distant, something impossible. And even now, there were days when the past still haunted him. But he was free. He was safe. And, for the first time, the future didn't feel like something to be afraid of. He smiled. Yeah, I think I am. Lucas nodded, satisfied. Good. Now, let's go get burgers. I'm starving. Ethan laughed, closing his notebook. You're always starving. As they walked toward town, the sun shining down on them, Ethan realized something. The courtroom had once been the place where he fought for survival. But now, it was just a chapter in his story. And he was ready to start a new one. Ethan Carter's journey through the courtroom was intense, emotional, and full of twists. But in the end, justice prevailed. This story reminds us that the truth always finds its way out, no matter how hard someone tries to bury it. But what do you think? What was the most shocking moment of the trial for you? And what would you have done in Ethan's place? Let us know where in the world you're watching from in the comments. We love seeing how far our stories travel. And if you want to see more gripping stories, shocking betrayals, and tales of endurance, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.